All right, so here we're looking at the plans and looking at the fuselage parts, and all of those pieces and lots of internals are there, lots of little pieces like the control column, etc. But a lot of basic formers have to be made and cut out, and shapes have to be cut. One thing you do is you look on the directions, and it has in Polish little asterisks, and they tell you how thick some of the pieces of backing have to be. So what it means is if you cut something out with 2 asterisks or 3 asterisks, it needs to be on, like in this case, 2 asterisks, it needs to be on 0.5 millimeter backing. In my case, I'm going to use balsa wood, and it turns out I'm going to have to sand it down a little. But here I've glued it all on. I've taken off these pieces and roughly cut them. These are all pieces that had double asterisks on them, and so it's on a piece of balsa wood, 1/32 sheet. I just find this easier to work with. Glued them on just with the plain old glue that I'm using to put the whole model together. Let them dry. And now you begin the task of cutting all these things out. It can be tedious, but it's like building an old-fashioned balsa model airplane. One thing to notice, like around curves here, I tend to like to cut on the right side of something, and so I can see the left side of it, and I cut right down the line. But notice I'm cutting several times. You don't cut deep first time, you cut multiple times, like little gentle passes, and things will come out. Remember, you're cutting and sometimes against cross graining things, and so you can chip things and break them up. So I'm using very little pressure and just making several passes as I go. A lot of it is freehand, and a lot of it is with a straight edge. So you have to be very precise with these. I cut on the line usually. It depends on the model, I guess. But generally speaking, I cut on the line. And then there's little places, like right here, I'm cutting off these little ears. I can do those freehand. But when I can, I use a straight edge. A lot of times on certain shapes, you can't. Like some of those fuselage shapes are curved, and you can't use a straight edge. You have to do it by eye, and you have to just draw right along the line. And it's neither as hard nor as easy as it looks, but with time you get pretty good at it, and you can cut a real nice smooth curve without lots of jagged edges and stops and starts and all the rest. But the watchword is to just take your time, take it slow, be diligent and careful. But again, multiple passes is much better than one huge gigantic thrust that breaks through all of the wood, or even I suppose if you're using cardboard. So more delicate you are, the better. And there's a little former that's cut out that's going to be near the front. Now this particular one has a little tiny hole in a W. Hold it for the camera, I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty small. But in Polish, W means to cut out. So that's going to be part of where the the shaft for the motor is going to go. So to do that, what I'm going to do, it's a little tiny circle. I sort of start it with an X-Acto blade, and then I take a sharpened tip of a bamboo skewer. You could use a pencil, I suppose, or a pencil would work great. And I stick it in that hole and kind of ream it out. Then I get a nice, even little circle. So that's where ultimately, again, our little shaft is going to go through to help us make our motor rotate. Now you've got all the parts cut out, and now I'm starting to test fit things. You can see there's little places like here where some control cables are going to go through, so I poked holes through those. There's other parts that are carefully cut, like there are a couple of slots here that are cut out for some side formers that are going to go on ultimately. And then down at the base on either side of the fuselage, there's 2 little holes that were cut out the same way I cut that other hole out in the front. Those are going to be for the wire that holds the engine together. Now, or it puts the engine on. Now, when I start to put things together, like this former is going to go on top, it has a couple ears on it, carefully cut out, and it fits in that slot very nicely. It's a well-designed kit so far. Problem is, you can see it's a little thick. So that piece is actually a little too thick to fit in there, so it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the way it needs to. So I got to thin it out. I got to thin all of these out because they're supposed to be on 0.5 millimeter backing. So what I do is I use a sanding block, and I use a little bit of blue tack, which is kind of sticky, gummy stuff, because it's hard to grab these pieces. But if you put this on top, you can use it as a handle. It sticks to the paper, and then you can sort of roll it around. And the key here, it's like that's how you do vac formed models. You circle around like 20 times or 15 times one direction, and then you go the other direction because you want to make it as even as possible. It takes a little practice, and you check it constantly, and you look, and if you're really careful, you really take calipers and check and see that you're at a 0.5 millimeter. In my mind, I'm just doing it by eye until it fits nicely. And all these pieces have to be done this way if you're using balsa, like which I do in my case, because it isn't exactly a 0.5 millimeter in thickness. I do find it important to keep that close. I say there's much thinner, and that wasn't a whole lot of painful stuff. That's pretty easy. And then you can sort of, like here, it needs a little bit more off on one side. You can sort of take that off very carefully. But you're going to have to do that with all of these. But now when I test fit it, that's just with a little bit of sanding. Now it's flush, and hope you can see it, but now it fits in that slot and doesn't overlap, and so it's the right thickness. So that's wonderful. So now what you got to do, go through and basically sand all of these pieces to the correct thickness. Let's see when it fits in that slot. Boom, there it goes. So that's going to be, ultimately how it's going to fit in there when we form the fuselage shape. That'll be really nice. It'll be strong. It'll be good. But sadly, I have to do that on all of these. It takes a fair amount of time to do this, but it's also not impossible. I use the sports section usually of the newspaper, so that your wife doesn't yell at you for sandpaper all over the place. I'm doing this on our dining room table. Probably shouldn't. A little chilly in the garage. And even the larger pieces, the same thing. Take a piece of that blue tack and kind of spread it out and sand it. And you don't put a lot of pressure on it. Let the sandpaper do its job. And again, with some practice, it works pretty well. Sometimes what happens, like in my case, I'm getting dust in there and it makes it not so sticky. So you got to pull the blue tack and sort of make it sticky again between your fingers and then put it down. But you just keep doing this. Ultimately, all these pieces have to be sanded. So that's what I ended up doing next. Now, once all that's done, all these pieces have been sanded. Now I'm starting to look at some other pieces. So printed on here are some internal pieces that need to go on here. So for example, there's a little pouch that needs to go on one side. It just gives a little three-dimensional look to it. There's I'll try to point it out here. There's little throttle. I think that's supposed to be a throttle adjuster. There's a compass or something that goes on. There's some kind of instrument. There are some little foot skids that go under the rudder pedals. Here there's a little pouch, maybe it's a map case that goes on one side, and there's the a pump for bringing up pressure, I think, in the fuel system that has to be made. So we'll start with some of the simpler pieces, the flat pieces. So we found that little black patch. It's right there by my thumb, my finger, right there. And so what do? This is just to give a little three-dimensional look to the interior. All you need to do is cut that out. Now, it looks boring, but it's not. Stay with me. Again, when you cut a piece of paper, you don't try to cut it through all at once. You cut it very carefully, and you cut it several times in order to get through completely. In this case, I got a sharp blade, so it's going through pretty well. But I still notice I'm taking it very carefully, and I'm doing multiple little cuts. I move the paper around a lot in order to make it very, for me, ergonometrically easier for me to cut. So don't be afraid to move things around on your building board. And when you cut things, especially things that are very delicate, like those two little slots, those two little ears up there, you just move the paper until you got it just where you want it. Because remember, the knife will cut a little further than you think. So you got to sort of make sure you're careful. And you pull them out of the paper, like here, it didn't quite go. So I have to go back and take a little bit more, give a little bit more shot. You don't want to pull and rip, because in this case, you want to keep those little ears on there. So there, I got it off. Now there you have a nice little piece of paper, and it will actually add a lot to the interior, but notice it's got white edges. So what you want to do is color those. In my case, I'm just using a black Sharpie. You can use paint, you can use other markers. Black seems to work fine. So you just literally go through and touch the edges of the black. And with the Sharpie, it's kind of got thick pigment. You can kind of hold it there, and it'll sort of wick into the pieces if you can't get the tip down real tight to the piece of paper. It'll sort of wick in, and it'll color all the white places. Again, the idea is so that you don't have any glaring edges sticking out. I mean, this is the equivalent in plastic models of filling seams, as far as I'm concerned. It's something that you should do to make it look good. See, in here, there's a little bit on there, but if I just hold that to the edge like that and just touch it, it'll wick and get the very corner in place. So there's that piece done. So now, again, it looks silly, but you'd be amazed how, you could just leave it as is. You can see there's a dark mark printed on that side right there. But with a little bit of three-dimensional look to it, and you could do more work with it to make it even more three-dimensional if you wished, it just gives a little extra interest. So you take a little glue, and I find when you're doing these really fine pieces, that bamboo skewer is wonderful because you can sharpen it down to something that's very sharp. And you can just grab little bits of glue and just dab them on there. You don't need a lot. Just sort of coating that general area. You don't need to go crazy. And then I tend to use, how do you pick it up? This sounds silly, but this is useful. I tend to use an X-Acto blade. You just sort of stab it, it'll stick, and then you can very precisely put it down. And then give a little dab here and a dab there. Make sure it's straight where you want it. Make sure it looks good. Get off any excess glue that might squitch out. And that's all there is to it. So that's that piece done. Now, on this little floorboard here, those two little silver places, same thing. You got to find the two little pieces. And there they are by the cowling. And again, when you cut these out, notice I'm going to cut these kind of carefully. That one takes at least twice to cut through it, and then on this side. And again, I tend to cut so that I can see what's to the left of the line, and I cut along the right, and I cut right over the line. And then you turn the page, and you keep going. And you just keep cutting very carefully and methodically. When you get them out, sometimes there's little ears and bits that are still in there, so I'm just really trimming these. So you can't see it. There's a little piece of paper, like little saw teeth. So I'm just kind of getting rid of those on the edges just to make them look a little better. That's because I didn't cut them as neatly as I should have. Now I hold it with some tweezers, and this time I'm going to fill with a Sharpie that happens to be aluminum or silver in color. Seems to look nice. And you just hold it with the tweezers and go around the edges. Just being careful to not color the color, just the edges if you can possibly help it. And you get both of those colored. You take your little bit of glue and you pop it along the places where your rudder bar is going to go. I believe that's for the heels and stuff of the pilot, so they don't go through the floorboards. Give them a little something to a frictionless thing to rub against. And the little glue on the other side, pop the other one on. And these are just little things that will barely be noticeable, but you'll know they're there, and they will actually look better. It gives a little bit more three-dimensional look to these things. Remember, this is paper, and so we're trying to make the paper fool us into thinking that there's more there than there is. It's kind of fun. It's kind of the art of it and the magic of it. That's part of the reason I enjoy doing these so much. Now, this throttle quadrant is dicey. It goes right in there, and we'll put a little pulled sprue rod later for the actual actuator. But that thing, there's two pieces. They're sort of triangular looking. There's a silver one that I cut out here, and then I have to color the edges. But the part that's the actuator has a little red knob on top, and we're gonna gussy that up a little bit with a blob of glue to give it a more three-dimensional look. But that part is very tough to cut out because it's actually got a frame that's cut out of the middle of it. You can see I'm very carefully cutting around that little circle. There's a red dot that's sort of be where the guy grabs. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's not easy to cut. And you have to very carefully go around with a very sharp blade and take your time. And ultimately it'll come out. If heaven forbid it rips, it's not the end of the world, because you can make one from scratch if you need to. This to me is almost as far as I can go with paper. At this point, I'd probably build these things out of plastic, and that's what I'm more used to. But again, getting some edges done, got them both colored, and now I grab my little glue, plop it down where it's supposed to go, and then I put the silver backing down first, which gives a little more elevation to the final throttle. And again, later on, we'll plug in a piece of rod that will make it look really interesting. And we'll also, like I said, make that little knob stand out a little bit. And then I take a little bit more glue, put it on top of that first piece, and add the actual throttle lever to that. And that's all there is to it. That's the first step. So now we've got things like the seat to do, we've got rudder pedals to do, we've got lots of other things to go. But that will be where we're going to start next time. Thanks for watching.